towards refugees, broken political systems, and the shifting tides of history, which will, in the course of just 3 generations, miraculously deem what was criminal suddenly noble, and vice versa. It's an Australian story. Australia, white Australia, has a history teeming with refused, denied and demeaned people. It has been built on the hopes of immigrants, many of them refugees, the despair of convicts and the denial of its original inhabitants. In short, Australia, when viewed through the prism of late Western capitalism, is a snapshot of the broken consequences of colonialism, religious extremism and prejudice. So, to the story. Years ago, a man was born whose parents had no hope or chance in their home country, and so they decided to ship themselves to Australia. He was born into a big family that only had each other to rely on. The social system around them was weighted entirely against them culturally. Their religious practices were spurned, their rights impinged upon regularly. They were always blamed for local disorder and for any unsolved petty criminal activity. Consequently, they were hounded by the powers that were at the time, hounded and harassed, derided in the press and denied access to education and most pathways to a good, honest life. Now, doesn't that sound like an awfully familiar pattern? Anyway, unsurprisingly, they banded together, these young men. They pushed back at the system that showed them no respect. And more often than not, in that awful logic of self-fulfilling prophecies, they became vandals, then vagabonds, then horse thieves, bank robbers, and eventually, surprise, surprise, murderers. Now, when one of these lads was 11, he had saved a local boy from drowning in a river at great risk to himself. And the mayor awarded him a special sash for bravery. The 11-year-old boy grew up to become the leader of one of the most feared and revered, the most loathed and admired socially outcast band of thieves in white Australian history. No, it wasn't AC/DC. It was the Kelly Gang. That boy was Ned Kelly, the outlaw. Now, Ned was an Irish Catholic at a time when the Church of England and the Protestants run Australia. He was poor and he had no chance of getting access to society. It was a walled society. It was a xenophobic society. It was a society that closed ranks and sat on its piles of gold greedily in its gleaming towers. And these days, he is seen as one of Australia's greatest heroes. A forward-thinking, albeit entirely self-educated and unsophisticated, agitator for social change. Now, he was tried and hung as a murderer and a thief, the only member of the Kelly Gang left alive after a terrible siege with burning buildings and terrified civilian hostages. He had survived the siege in his trademark armour. And when they captured him, they found under that armour that grown man was wearing the sash he had been awarded at 11 years of age. The sash that deemed his actions worthy of respect. The sash that said thank you. Now, we are back in times of crisis. A time of xenophobia and closed ranks and walls and endless religious and moral and economic justifications for massive wealth gaps and massive social disorder and massive cultural fragmentation. Countless justifications, but no solutions. Now, the award tonight marks a great humanitarian achievement. It is a formalised way of saying thank you to one person specifically, but perhaps most importantly, it carries with it the inexpressible thanks to all who work in humanitarian fields, often at great personal cost. Across the globe, hope comes with these individuals who dedicate their lives to the service of refugees and the internally displaced. Hope is embodied in the field workers and in the volunteers like our Nansen laureate tonight. People who bring refugees and host communities together. In these people, we have not just the ground force, but the beating heart and moral impulse to achieve change. The Nansen Refugee Award winners and finalists embody the dedication that shows us how we can transform brutal disruption into great human triumph. Now, as an artist, it's my job to explore the human condition through the telling of story. And I believe art should provoke us to question our values, both as individuals and as a society. So I'd like to finish with one more story. It's a work that many of you will know. Now, my son Iggy is here with me tonight. He's looking askance because his mother's mentioning his name. And do you remember reading The Silver Sword? Well, The Silver Sword is a story from yet another time of great disruption. A story from the Second World War. The consequences which led, of course, to the formation of our beloved UNHCR. And as Iggy and his father and I read this story together, I realised how profoundly relevant to the world today it still is. It's about the good in people. It's a call for open and compassionate concern for the plight of those less fortunate than ourselves. People tossed about like corks in a storm. Vulnerable people like that 11-year-old Ned Kelly. People who are served by great humanitarians like Dr. Attar. And so, it is people like Dr. Attar, our Nansen laureate tonight, who personify that good and who inspire us to build a better future for everyone. Thank you.